Welcome. This is our fourth annual International Forum on Youth. This is a week-long event highlighting challenges and opportunities for young people, not only here at College of the Canyons, but across the world. And we have a great slate of events all throughout the week. We begin with a panel discussion. Tomorrow, we're going to have a really wonderful talk about career and life and college planning. Wednesday, we're going to talk about the future of water in California, assuming that we still have water in California, I'm not sure. And then Thursday, I think the highlight of the whole week, we will have a student panel where us old guys step away for once and let all of you have your chance to share in your thoughts. With that in mind, this is a panel discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists here in just a moment. I'm Brent Riffel. I'm in the history department here at College of the Canyons. I'm also one of our co-lead faculty members. There's my other co-lead faculty member, Comprehensive Internationalization, being shy over there, Saburo Matsumoto. And one of the things that we're going to do today is have a discussion about the state of democracy in the West. We have American scholars, we have a British scholar, but we also, along the way, want to hear from you. If you have clarifying questions, if something's not making sense, please jump in and ask away. And then we'll also carve out some time at the end for your questions. And with that, I think we'll begin. Again, thank you for being here. Nice to see you. I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces. It's great to see you. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. I'm going to start with our guest from the UK. I think it's evening time for you there, so thanks for skipping dinner to be with us, Eunice. Eunice Goes. Dr. Eunice Goes is joined the School of Communications, Arts, and Social Sciences at Richmond University in the United Kingdom. She holds a doctorate in politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, an MA in politics from the University of Warwick, and a BA in international relations from Lisbon University in Portugal. Her areas of expertise are British party politics, British political thought, and Britain's relationship with Europe. And
then going down to things like the Boy Scouts, right? And institutions that, typically are thought of as, helping as from a young age develop a sense of duty to some common good, right? And again, perhaps for good reason, because of violations or abuses that have taken place. I feel that a lot of our trust in some of our institutions has been undermined, and I worry about the effect that that's having on our democracy today. I'll let the political scientists talk about, how that factors into government and how they're following the procedures. But I'm kind of concerned about that in terms of when we think of the state of democracy from a bigger picture.
So I'm hearing from both the UK perspective, from your perspective, about fragility, not just in terms of the political class and the leadership class, but also at other levels of the institutional rot or erosion, as you might put it. Again, media, social institutions. I think the Boy Scouts is a good example. So I turn this to you, Phil. What's your take on this? Are these democratic institutions holding together? Are they breaking apart? Is it somewhere in the middle? What's your stance here?
So I'm gonna probably chart out a middle and hopefully more optimistic perspective, but I don't want to discount anything that's been said previously. The challenges facing democracy are real, and ones that we'll talk about in more detail as we go along. Going back to Brent's immediate metaphor of going to the doctor to get a checkup, I think January 6th was the reason why a lot of people said, I need to go to the doctor and find out what the health of this democracy is. Right? It caused people to ask that question. I know among political scientists, it caused them to start reflecting on that. What is the status of our democracy? And I think the election that we just had, which I'll talk about more later on in my presentation, was the report that we got back about our condition. And I would say that the report was actually good, but it was because citizens, voters, went ahead and took corrective action. So one of the which is supposed to act as a backstop for our democracy. These are the people who aren't accountable by way of voting in many instances. These are people who are supposed to make judgments based on the law. They did that. They did that. Now, does that mean we're free and clear and there's no problems in the future? No, I don't think so. I think we still have many things to worry about. But the status of democracy right now in the United States, I would say, is okay. but it's not going to stay that way on its own. Democracy is okay when citizens are participating.
Just to echo your point, I thought it was encouraging, and I think you're sort of getting at this, but I thought it was encouraging last Tuesday that as the results came in, some of the most vociferous election deniers who then lost elections that night conceded and took the loss after saying for months that they might not do that. So I think even among those who really have denied these elections and the legitimacy of our elections, I think they seem to be getting the message too from the voters.
I think that's very true. If I can just add one thing, in Eunice, I think mentioned this, there are a lot of things that happen in our political system that aren't codified. They're not in law.
Right.
They're just rules and customs that everybody agrees to. I think you mentioned, like, sort of the agreement is we're going to play this game, not that politics is a game, but we're going to play within these guardrails, these rules. And a lot of those customs were violated before, but exactly what Brent is saying, there was sort of a reassertion that, okay, even the people who didn't seem to understand the importance of that after the 2020 elections, they seem to understand it now. And that was also very encouraging.
Yeah, I thought so too. I want to turn back to Eunice now and take this conversation in the direction of the youth and the youth vote. This is the International Forum on Youth. And so I want to center that today. So I think it's commonly said in the West that people, not just young people, but people of all ages often say that their vote doesn't matter, that there's a cynicism about elections and about voting. But how have young people impacted recent elections, both in the UK and I'll turn to our American guests as well. But in other words, what's the state of the youth vote in the West today? What's the relevance and importance of young people voting? We talk a lot about how we want young people to vote, but why should they? And Eunice, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, they should vote because if they do not vote, those in power will simply ignore them. And I think in Britain, we can see that very visibly, where the two main parties essentially focus on developing programs of government that privilege older voters. So protections of pensions and so on. If we look at the state of our politics, you can see that young people are having a really rough deal. Housing is extremely expensive and accessible. Many university students, they go back home to the parents' home because they cannot rent, they cannot find housing, affordable housing for them once they start working. Tuition fees, so the funding of higher education has trebled in the last 10 years. So many other issues. They are young people are those who tend to be working in temporary work with no protection, so in more insecure jobs, and this has been allowed to happen because essentially lawmakers think that young voters are not participating in elections. They are doing politics for those who participate. I think it was Albert Hirschman who wrote in that very important book for political scientists, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, that exercising voice is the most important thing that a citizen can do. Exiting the system, not participating, does not operate in the same way than when we're going to the shop or we stop consuming one particular consumer good, and then companies react to the consumer input. So if we no longer drink, let's say, Coca-Cola, we're no longer buying that, they will change their formula because they're losing consumers. Politics does not work that way. So the youth has faced that problem not only in Britain, but I think across Europe. And this is then compounded by another problem. And the problem has to do, young people are not the majority of the electorate in Britain and in the rest of Europe. So if the majority of young people are not voting, and then they already are not a numerical majority, then we are in trouble. because essentially what we have, it's not a democracy, but what the political theorist David Runciman called a gerontocracy. So a government of middle-aged to old people governing to other middle-aged and old people. So that's essentially the basic lesson. This being said, there's also some interesting patterns in voting and how the voting is happening in the United Kingdom. We saw with the Brexit referendum and in the different elections that took place since then. So there's been a general election in 2017 and then in 2019, again, two symptoms of a fragile political system that is going through a lot of turbulence. We saw two very interesting patterns. The overwhelmingly vote of the young during the Brexit referendum was to remain in the European Union. And the young voters also tend to elect their candidates when they are concentrated in those urban centers and university towns. And that has essentially contributed to the polarization of the voting in Britain. So the younger people tend to vote for the Labour Party, so a centre-left party, and there is a very strong representation in the urban centres and university towns of the United Kingdom, but they are far less represented in the suburban areas and also in the rural areas of the United Kingdom. The problem in Britain is that though there is higher concentrations of population in urban centers, there are far more constituencies in the suburban areas and in the rural areas. So even with very high turnouts in cities like London, Bristol, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and so on, their votes won't make a lot of difference because votes, let's say in Sunderland, count in the end more. They elect more MPs than in those London cities. So this has been the pattern of vote. Another kind of, I try to hang on to the other optimistic story about youth participation. And that one took place in 2014, and that was the Scottish referendum on independence. Now, this was a very interesting referendum that almost led to the breakup of the United Kingdom. But two things happened during that referendum. The first one was that the Scottish government decided to lower the voting age to 16. And so there was very, very, very big participation of young people, not only in the referendum, but participating in lots of campaigning activities. And in fact, the debate on Scottish referendum was very much led by civil society. So the political parties were, of course, an important component of that debate, but they were not the most important one. And so there was a sense of enthusiasm, interest, the sense that this was a momentous decision and that they wanted to engage. And so this is another consideration that the current Scottish government in Scotland is planning to do, lowering the voting age to 16. So, and the idea is if we engage voters at 16, if they start to participate, if they are engaged, then this is a habit. The habit of voting is one that will continue with adult life. So that's one sign of civic engagement and of enthusiasm as well, of engagement of young people. But I think more needs to be done for the voices of young people to count far more in British politics and in European politics, and I think all over the world, for those voices to count, because ultimately the people in government at the moment are taking really important decisions that affect mostly their lives, your lives, and not the lives of, middle-aged people like me and older people who are essentially getting a much better deal out of democratic politics.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And to one of your points about voting age, very little discussion in the United States about lowering the voting age. It's not something that's come up much, and it's really interesting to see Scotland be a laboratory for that. One other thing I wanted to emphasize was the term gerontocracy that you used. As a historian, when I think about this idea of a gerontocracy, this notion of a society sort of ruled by its aging leadership, I'm reminded of the late Soviet Union, which was governed in the 1980s by an increasingly out of touch, aging political class. And they were not always in step with what the needs were of younger citizens in the Soviet Union And in many ways, that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Obviously, there were many other factors. But I'll turn to you, Marco. What's the state of the youth vote? Why does it matter? And are leaders in this country or the West in general, are they out of step with the youth?
Yeah. Well, I'll let Phil talk about, the state of the youth vote, because
Okay.
that's going to be an area for political scientists. But why it matters, think about it from a philosophical, perspective. One thing that I know is that the youth tend to vote. What engages the youth is more of a value-based vote, right? I know that we saw that in the election this time in battleground states where the right to choose was up for the vote. That's where a lot of young voters came out to vote. Did they vote on whether there should be online gambling and the tax that was going to? Probably not, right? Perhaps one of the reasons is, well, I don't have any skin in the game at that point, right? Because I don't really have the money that's going to be taxed or whatever to lose, right? So the young tend to vote based on more idealistic values, right? And that's going to be important, right? If we're going to hold up, the republic, hold up a healthy state of democracy. I think about it just anecdotally, and maybe this is an analogy of the way that I think about, why the youth vote might matter. I was talking to one of my best friends. He's going through a divorce. He and his wife are both highly successful. He's an investment banker. She's an attorney, and they make a lot of money. And the divorce has been going on now for about 1.5 years, and it has gotten ugly. It has gone into the courts, and what their focus is hiring attorneys, trying to ensure that their interests are represented, that whatever they've worked for isn't going to be taken away, right? And trying to negotiate that. And that, in a lot of ways, right, as I talk to him and as I see what's going on, right, I see his 4-year-old and his 6-year-old child that they have, right, and the impact that that's having on them. And now they can care less about who gets what and where this goes and how they allocate this or that, right? They're more worried about the common good, right? And just trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for their futures, right? I mean, at 4 and 6, they can't express this, but we know that this is more where their heads are. And when we think about this in terms of governance and the things that matter, right? Who's going to be taking that long-term approach when we think of things like climate change, when we think of things like a right to a future and how we ensure that, right? Well, I'm more worried about I'm living paycheck to paycheck, if I'm 45 or something like that, right? And to think about climate change, well, it's a little harder when I have perhaps something to lose that I have worked so hard for, right? And so it, I think, balances out, right, our views, right, and ensures that, like Dr. Goes said, that it's not forgotten by those who are in office, right? That because if you leave it up to us, the older voters, it will. And one thing that I see, and this is again anecdotally, working in the city, we had an election voting booth at the office that I used to work at. And one thing I saw every election cycle, whether it was the smallest local election or whether it was the midterms or an important presidential election, I guarantee you the ones that I would see out there were the older voters, right? Coming in their walkers, right? Whatever it took, right? This was before, it was easy to vote online and whatnot. And if that was the only day they were going out in the month, they were going out to vote, right? And so I know that their voice is going to be represented. I've spent enough years watching election after election to know that. Who wasn't there typically were the younger voters, right? And so understanding that, just anecdotally, the state of, the youth vote, I think it is important that, we balance those concerns that, those that, are older might have with those that are young.
Well, it's interesting. I think about, my dad, for example, is 77, and he's a very committed voter. He's like the person you're talking about, and he has skin in the game. There's policy decisions that he feels are going to impact his life in the next few years. And yet I hope he lives to be 150. But in reality,
his time is limited compared to someone maybe in their teens or 20s, who, in my view, has a lot more skin in the game, actually, when you think about the decades ahead, right? So I turn to you, Phil, and I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. And what's your take on the value of the youth vote? Our leadership disconnected from the youth? And what's your stance on this?
Okay, and I'm gonna.
And I know you have some
I have
data
data
to share.
That's what we do with the science. So I'm gonna give you some charts of data. Before I do, can I ask a question? How many of you are in favor of lowering the voting age to 16? You just, how many, okay, so I know sometimes people just don't vote at all. How many of you are adamantly opposed to the idea of 16-year-old being able to vote? Right, so it's interesting, we talk about the youth vote, it's like, well, that's not very young, the youth vote, right? So there are literally more hands here that against lowering the age. I didn't know that about Scotland, so that was interesting. And just by way of reframing things, I'm going to refer to voters who are over 60 as older and not old, but I have skin in that game.
Why?
There we go. I'm going to stand up. For
Seasoned veterans.
Seasoned, right? Seasoned. So
That's right.
with that in mind, I want to go through some charts, and I know some people are really good with charts and some people don't get charts, so I'm going to go kind of slow. And this is the perfect point at which, if you want to ask clarifying questions, then ask them. What this chart is showing is voter turnout by age in the elections beginning in 1986. I don't know why they put 94 on there since they don't need any data there. And one of the things, so if you look, the blue bar, I'm going to walk over here. So the blue bar is 18 to 29, and the reddish bar is 30 to 44. The green one is 45 to 59, and then the purple bar is older people. And is there anything that you noticed about the pattern here of voting turnout in these elections?
The votes that entail whether we'll have or which presidential candidate we'll have is much higher than the midterm elections.
Right. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, the midterm elections refers to, here, let me turn this on. Let's see. Oops.
You need to advance it.
It's not advancing.
Oh, you know what?
So we elect presidents every 4 years. Hopefully you guys know this, or you'll be taking a clip of 2015 to learn it. And then every 2 years, we have what are called midterm elections. They're exactly right, where we're voting for national office, but we're not voting for president. And so what you can see is in the midterm elections, voter turnout goes down. During a presidential election, it goes up. In the midterm election, it goes down and up and down. And the pattern is pretty consistent, right? And so one thing I point out is that voter turnout is lower among younger people and older people and everybody in between the same way. We all go up and down like that. But consistently, younger people are voting less. Turnout is less among the 18 to 29 crowd. Does this advance now or again? Oh yeah. No, here we go.
Go back.
So now it's working good. Okay. But if you look at the very end of this graph, what you can see is in 2018, voter turnout around younger people went up. And then in the presidential election, it went up again. So a lot of what political scientists were wondering is like, well, what's going to happen in 2022? Is it going to revert back to sort of the average voting, which is around 20% during midterms, or is it going to continue to go up? And what we saw in this election is, in fact, it wasn't quite as high as 2018, but 27% cast a ballot of people in this age group. And this age group, I believe, is the 18 to 29 group. And so participation did go up, which is an encouraging sign. I think one thing that everybody agrees on is the more you guys participate, the better our democracy functions. But I want to go into the details a little bit more on this. This is from exit polls that were done after the election. And this is a breakdown of voting from ages 18 to 24, 25 to 29, and so on. What you can see, the 7% there, That means that people between 18 and 24, most, I'm assuming that's mostly you guys, you make up 7% of the election. Of the people who vote, you make 7%. And that makes me seem like a really small number. 7%, look, all these other groups, so much larger, the 65 and older group, much larger. But in elections that are decided that are razor thin, really close elections, which is what we're having now, your guys' votes can determine who the winners and who the losers are. If you're voting differently than older voters. And one of the things that I'm going to show you is that in fact, you are voting differently. This is voter turnout, the youth vote, 18 to 29 now, from 1992 to 2022. And what you can see is between 1992 and 2002, the youth vote was basically split between Democrats and Republicans. It was pretty evenly split. But around 2002, the 2002 election, or 2004, you start to see a split. You start to see a difference in the way that young people are voting. They're voting for Democrats. And Eunice had pointed out that in the UK, young people are voting for the Labour Party. This is a pattern that we see, and we're seeing, and that split is pretty consistent all the way from 2004 on. Right, so you can see that split there. So this again is looking at the youth vote in the 2002 midterm election, the one that we just had. Among groups 18 to 29, 63% of that age group voted for Democrats. 35% voted for Republicans. If you look at the other end, the 45 to 64 and the 65 and older, they vote very differently than you do. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's for you to decide. But what we know is that you guys are voting differently than older people. Well, one of the things that I like to tell my students is that the way democracy works is that each one of you, each citizen who has a right to vote, you all have political authority. By virtue of being a citizen and eligible to vote, you have political authority. By political authority, I mean you have the right to determine who our rulers are. You get to determine who our rulers are. And by determining who our rulers are, you determine policy. So, why are young people voting so much differently than older people? Well, it's not hard to see. Here's support on gay marriage from 2005 to 2020. Right, the top line, the question they asked, this is a percentage of the same-sex marriage should be recognized by the law as valid. Now, support for same-sex marriage has been growing up over time. Younger people and older people have all seemed to accept this. But look at the percentages. Young people, the 18, and this is 18 to 34, 84% of that age group say that they should be recognized as valid. Among the older group, 55 and older, it's down to 60%. You guys have different views on this. These are kind of the value-based things that Martha was talking about. But it's not just on social issues. Climate change was one of the things causing younger people to go to the ballot box. So in this one, this is some surveys that were done that asked the percentage of adults who say that climate change should be a priority to ensure sustainable planet for future governments. The Gen Z group, these are, I think, 1996 on, and the next older cohort, 67 to 71% are saying this should be a priority. As you get older, this is seen viewed to be less of a priority. The percentages say climate change is the top concern. Younger people, 37% say this is the top concern. It goes down, generally speaking, with age. Have you taken personal steps to address climate change? Again, among younger people, more of a concern. Your views, your interests are different than older people. On climate change, why are your interests different than older people such as myself?
Ideally, we'll be around to see the damage of it.
Right, I'll be dead. You guys won't, your kids won't. The worst effects of climate change, if they bear out the way the model is talking about, you guys will have to deal with it. And as Brent and I were talking about before, the options to address it, become increasingly limited. Well, one thing that's been touched on by everybody is if you guys don't vote, then the politicians are going to take into account the interests and the concerns of the people who do vote, who might be less willing to make the kind of sacrifices that need to be made to address climate change. Here's one other issue. Same-sex abortion became a big issue with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? And so just take a look at the very end of the charts on the top and the bottom. The top one is from 18 to 29. With respect to the abortion issue, this is the question that was asked. Will you consider yourself to be pro-choice or pro-life? 71% of people who are 18 to 29 call themselves pro-life, pro-choice. If you look at the split among older people, in this case it's 50 to 64, they're almost evenly split. You have different views than older people, right? I'll go back to the voting. But here's the thing. As I said before, you have political authority. But when you don't vote, your political authority doesn't disappear. You take your political authority and what you do is you give it to people who do vote. When you don't vote, what happens is you're no longer part of the picture. And now the people who are voting are electing our leaders, and they are determining what those policies may be. And they could be very different than what you believe. So if you want to know why you should vote, from the 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, the more citizens participate, the better democracy functions. But more individually, your interests aren't being reflected in the policies because the people who are getting elected are going to be more concerned about me because I vote, older people vote, and I have money. I can donate to campaigns. You guys, you don't have money. That's why you're here. You want to get to a place where you can make money, right? So that you can be in my position. But until you get to that point, the only thing you have is your vote. And if you don't use it, your political authority doesn't go away. You give it to me to let me vote for what I want. Okay. So just remember that not participating has costs, serious costs. And so with that, end of lecture. Now, I told this to Brent. If you're taking my class, you would get this lecture about 10 times over the course of this semester. You're just getting it once, so consider yourself lucky.
Although he's willing to come to your home.
Oh,
absolutely.
I'm going to bullhorn in front of your house.
He's happy to do it. Yes, please. Jay.
Question, I'm sure you guys have practiced, okay, so this is 2022.
Correct.
So back in the day, when it's 2020, the people who were 29, nowadays, 49, 20 years later. I'm wondering, as people grow older, they become more conservative than they grow, and why that is.
Well, absolutely. So there's a pattern that as younger people get older, they tend to vote differently because their life circumstances change. So I think Marco was saying that people sort of vote idealistically. As you get older and now you have a mortgage, you have kids and you're paying for college and things like that, your priorities change. And so the policies that you're going to advocate change. But I don't think that's true on certain kind of social views. Like I think about same-sex marriage. It's not like people, like I know that when I was younger, my views on same-sex marriage evolved over time. My kids basically educated me about the idea that, yeah, why would it matter whether two people who love each other get married? When I got older, my views didn't revert back to more conservative views, right? My views on reproductive rights didn't revert back. It's on the economic issues that as people get older, that's when you start to see them, when they start noticing money coming out of their checkbook or having to pay for your guys' college or your kids' college, that's what changes. So some value questions don't change, some economic issues do change.
No, but I wonder though, and this is a concern that I have though, if that shift takes place and we start to, vote on a more economic level, but does that crowd out, right, the ways that we think of values, so that, 20, 30 years down the road, right, when your kids are concerned about certain values, right, that are now, becoming the norm in their generation, are you going to see that as a threat to your value system, to the ways that you live your life, right? And the question is, I'm always concerned that as we continue to, take things like, philosophy courses, humanities courses out of our educational model, right? The liberal arts education, right? Perhaps that's one of the things that has allowed the youth to be more open-minded, right? To think more open-mindedly since, the 1960s in particular, right? And not to say that, and there's a threat to that. Well, isn't that just, critical race theory and indoctrination and into the education, right? And it's like, well, no, nobody's forcing you to think anything you want, right? But it's, opening your mind to the possibilities that you might be wrong, right? And I think this is one of the things that really concerns me, as I'm sure there will be a question somewhere in there about technology and, the state of our democracy, right? Our political discourse and just our discourse in general, right? And whether or not we're able to have that and think about that in, more than 140 characters, right? Or in more than just a picture, and whether we're able to, see the nuances involved to then allow us to think for ourselves that, hey, I might be wrong, right? Of whatever it is that I think, because that's going to be something that's important. As we get older, we start to think, oh no, perhaps, I don't know, right? I don't think it's that I stop thinking that way. It's just that other things might crowd out my ability to think that way. I have to have it all figured out by the time I'm 45, right? Isn't that the pressure that, you have? And if you don't, well, now it's not a thing about going back to school. Now it's a crisis that you have, this midlife crisis or something. And so I'm concerned about, the ways that we think about that might underlie the ways that, we think about voting, that might underlie the ways that we think about elections and whatnot.
Yeah, and to build on that, I do have a question about technology, because I think that's critical in our understanding of these issues. And I want to hear more from both of you, but I'll turn back to Eunice on this one. We'll just jump ahead to that one. In terms of technology, in terms of, you mentioned, you were referring to Twitter, for instance, or social media. I think I'm safe in saying that social media's arrival was packaged, presented to us as a way to bring people together, right? And in some ways it does that. There's another argument that argues that in some ways social media has fragmented us. It's actually pulled us apart. You could also perhaps argue it's doing a little bit of both at the same time. So I'll turn to Eunice, but I want to hear from everybody else too. How is technology and social media in particular, or technology more broadly, impacting our discourse, impacting the health or lack of health in democracy right now?
Right, thank you. Well, that is a very, very big question. And I think, well, the first thing to say is that, of course, social media, and in particular, those social media platforms that we use to, to be informed, to get knowledge about our politics and so on, they're a tool. They are not creating content. We select the content that we want to see on those platforms. So Twitter can be a highly polarizing tool, or it can be also a tool where we actually are learning things, we are meeting interesting people, we are learning more data. So it very much, we have some agency in the way that we control that social media and technology. Now, this being said, it is also true that political parties, and very strategic political parties, are becoming very savvy at using that technology, in particular in terms of introducing ads, certain information, and targeting that particular information to key voters, the key voters that those particular parties need to get on a ballot box to go and participate in the election and vote for them, and then give them electoral victory. And we saw in Britain two important patterns in the 2016 referendum on Brexit. There was a deluge of targeted ads, many of them with fake information, misinformation even, and that explain the vote to leave. So people, for instance, in Wales, which was a region of the United Kingdom or a nation of the United Kingdom, which was highly dependent on funds from the European Union, so it received a lot of money from the European Union for its own economic development. There was research that showed that a lot of those citizens were receiving targeted ads on their Facebook accounts about the dangers of immigration. The interesting thing was that in Wales, in particular in those old mining towns, ethnic diversity was practically non-existent. These were pretty much white towns with almost zero immigration or ethnic diverse populations. And yet those populations, those voters were highly alarmed by the threat of, this was one of the ads, Turkey joining the European Union, and the threat of 60 million Turkish people invading the United Kingdom, as some of the Leave campaign ads portrayed in their propaganda. We saw again that influence in 2017, and here it was very much to the benefit of the Labour Party. They were very savvy in the way that they organized their campaign, and they organized it, they used it in a way that was actually quite healthy, because it actually encouraged people to vote. They've organized it to mobilize campaigners and to mobilize people to vote. And of course, there was a bit of misinformation. And again, in 2019, we saw again that pattern of political parties using social media to campaign, to target specific voters. And at some point, we even had the Conservative Party pretending and presenting itself on Twitter as an institution that was a fact checker, not the Conservative Party, but presenting itself to the public as a fact checker, that is a reliable source of information. So the way that political parties use social media is not regulated and perhaps needs to be regulated, because if political parties are feeding citizens with misinformation, that is very, very serious. It's a distortion of the democratic process. The other pattern that we've seen, and this has become quite dangerous in the United Kingdom, is how the polarization of political discourse, which has become much coarser on sites like Twitter and Facebook, people insult each other. Well, that has led to an exponential rise in the number of threats, death threats, rape threats, violence threats against politicians, and female politicians are those that are the most targeted by, bots and other people who essentially hide their identities on social media. And we saw that in 2016, 2 weeks before the referendum, there was an MP that was assassinated by a member of parliament. And 2 years ago, there was a Conservative MP who was also assassinated by a member of parliament. So MPs now live in danger and live in fear of being targeted by their own voters. It is important to note that Britain has a very front-facing democracy. MPs meet their constituents every week on a regular basis. They hold open surgeries. So MPs are, if one day, on a Monday, they are discussing the war in Ukraine, on a Thursday, they are discussing garden wall disputes in their constituencies, access to healthcare, or some problem in a school. So the mundane issues that affect the lives of citizens very much. And this is something that is very important to voters. But if MPs, so parliamentarians, start to live in fear and require constant protection by the police, this is, I think, it's a warning sign that not everything is well. And on this, technology has had a role, because people read the wildest conspiracy theorists online. They are reading a lot of unreliable information. And perhaps the greatest threat to democracy is now the inability to distinguish facts from opinions, the inability to distinguish what is a reliable source of information and something that it is propaganda, lies, misinformation. And I think this is the biggest threat to democracy, and that has led to the greatest polarization of public opinion in the United States, in Great Britain and pretty much across Europe. Look at how, for instance, the question of immigration and asylum has become so salient in European politics. This was an issue that was practically inexistent 20 years ago. It was there, it was discussed, but not very much on the radar of voters. And now it has become extremely salient. Firstly, because we see the social media ads being placed on the social media platforms, targeting the voters that might have some concerns here and there. Those ads confirm those prejudices, and then it shapes their opinions, it shapes their voting preferences too. And then it leads also to a sense of license that anything can be said and in a way that we want, because people hide themselves behind fake identities. And so we have, again, the public debate becoming coarser. And so we lose the habit of knowing how to discuss, to deliberate. And we forget that very important aspect of democracy, which is, this is a political system, this is a form of addressing political conflict, but through discussion, through deliberation. And so we no longer deliberate. We no longer discuss. We no longer find that opposing views are legitimate, that our opponents might have a point. That we might learn from them. We essentially try to portray them as either saboteurs, as the previous British Prime Minister referred to MPs who voted to remain in the European Union. And who loses with this? It's us, citizens of democracies, because it means that our democracies are becoming much weaker, because we are losing the habit that democracy is also about solving our disagreements, solving our differences of opinions through discussion, through deliberation, through the transformation even of our own preferences, our own opinions, because we are learning different viewpoints. We are being taken out of our comfort zones by listening to the experiences of citizens who have lived different lives from us. So social media has contributed to that, but I think politicians have the capacity to bring some order into that, the marketplace of ideas that at the moment is very disorganized, very chaotic, more than anarchic, almost dangerous.
Excellent points. And I think, at least from the US perspective, a lot of the social media companies are built on a frankly libertarian model of this kind of an interest in not regulating the discourse on their platforms. And I would also add, you made this point, I want to reiterate it to our audience here. I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact that social media companies are advertising companies. Google's an advertising company. Facebook is an advertising company. We share our vacation photos as a means to help support their ad revenue, right? And so in that respect, those social media companies don't feel an obligation to maintain rigor in what they consider to be truth or untruth or misinformation or disinformation. They're in the advertising business, right? And you know that when you watch a television commercial, the ads may exaggerate the caliber of that product, but that's what we're used to in that world, in television. Social media is a new landscape, and I think we lose sight of that. To your other point, you made a lot of points, but one other point I wanted to touch on, and then I'll turn it over to Marco. It seems to me that social media has become a breeding ground of tribalism, as you pointed out, Eunice, of different groups sort of shouting across one another instead of dialogue. And it's very clear in light of events just in the last 2 weeks in this country, right here in California, that social media has been an instrument of political violence, and it's happening all over the West, it's happening all over the world. And I do think there are some positive things happening in social media and technology, but I share your concerns in a lot of different ways. Marco, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh.
Am I too negative? Are we being too negative? Did I excuse myself?
No. Where do I get started? But it's mostly meant as just the concerns, right? Like I see the potential, right, in social media, right? And understanding that it's the communication is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to bring us together, right? I was just watching some documentary on the start of Facebook, and did he start it as that? No, but at some point he shifted to, hey, I want to bring the world together, right? That wasn't his anticipated, Zuckerberg's first thing that he wanted. It was just some college project that he thought, oh, and then it caught on, and then all of a sudden he wanted to do this, right? Now, the concerns that I have are a lot, right? One of the interesting things is Dr. Goes, all of the stuff that she's mentioning, right, are in the UK, how relevant that is here in the US, right?
Yeah.
Like we're facing the same things, right? And where Brent talks about, social media companies being advertising companies. My concern is that they're not just advertising companies, but they are growth companies, right? So what they have become, right? Google, Facebook, Amazon, right? Their business model isn't just one of, hey, let's sell advertising and let's make revenue off of that, but it is, let's get investors by talking about how much we're going to grow, right? We saw what happened to Facebook or Meta with, now their job cutbacks and stuff, right? Because, well, the growth that he anticipated wasn't there. Now, how do they grow though? Right. And this is where the accumulation of data, right, comes in, right? And it might be the thing that is underlying, why there's, this polarism that's created, why there's all of these fears, and people are able to bring in stuff, right? Because they know what's going to push your buttons, right? They're beginning to accumulate data, right? Now, what is that going to do? Well, what that's going to do is it's going to give you less agency in what it is that you choose, right? Now, I worry, the reason it's so concerning to me, right, is because we just assume that, hey, of course, you're going to be able to choose what it is that you want to see. I don't know if that's a warranted assumption, right? I sit here in a room full primarily of what we call digital natives, right? So in other words, you don't know a world that wasn't, where the internet wasn't present, right? Where information wasn't accessible at the push of a button. And for many of you, it's going to be, don't know a world where there wasn't social media at some point, at least when we started to come in. I mean, you could probably think of the earliest time I heard of getting a social media account might have been in first or second grade. Like for us, that was at like 30, 35 years old or something, right? So it's vastly different in the ways that we interact with social media and how we use it than the ways you might use it.
We were born in log cabins.
Yeah. I'm chiseling stuff right now. No, but and so what brought this to the forefront for me was hanging out with my niece over the weekend, right? She's 17 and she's thinking of where to apply to school. She's turning in applications. She has a really good GPA. So she's got, options, and she's thinking about that, right? And she's telling me this while she's scrolling through her TikTok or whatever, right? And I'm looking at the ways that she's doing this, right? And it is just boom, 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 like nuclear pace, right? Like I can't even how do you know what's happening, right? And how is she talking to me at the same time that she's doing this, right? And it's just happening so fast. And so I think, well, this is the norm for her, right? Oh, and by the way, so when I finally got out of her, like where, what are you basing your decision on, where you're going to go? The number one thing she said, as long as it's not a red state. And I thought, okay, wait a minute, like this is already concerning, right? Because there are plenty of people that have plenty of thoughts and good thoughts that happen to live in red states or whatever you want to say, right? But she's already saying, nope, I don't want anything to do with that. It's easy for me if I determine who I follow to, unfollow or whatever, right? If so, are these the choices that we're making that might be breeding to this tribalism or polarization, right? But what's more concerning is something that Dr. Goes said about being able to access counter views, about being able to take in information, right? Are we even going to be able to access like the subtleties involved in things like, pro-life versus pro-choice, right? Or does it become just like a hashtag to us, right? And is this the way that the communication becomes for us, right? And this is what I referenced earlier in 140 characters or less, right? Now, where we talk about social media companies being an advertising company, a growth company, I hear a lot of people say that Twitter is the public space for ideas. And that concerns me. That really concerns me when I hear that. And when I think of that is how we're kind of going about it, because what happens is I go to the coffee shop where I would always, go and grade papers or whatever. I never had an office. And occasionally conversation would break out in the coffee shop, right? But as I, starting in like 2005, started to looking at it to where it is now, right? I normally see people just plugged in, right? And not really talking to the people around them in the community, but rather to, and it's great because you see people from all over the world, and that's great, but what are we really seeing, right? Are we really seeing the intricacies, the subtleties? Are we really kind of understanding that? And I know we can watch YouTube videos, and I hear everybody say, you know, well, hey, this is what I know. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? Well, I saw a YouTube video about it. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, that would, you know, it's great to some extent, right? But I don't know if that's gonna send it. How do we know who that person is and where they got? Do we check those sources? These types of things, right? So it's concerning about, you know, the ways in which we communicate and how that is, whether it's beneficial or not to a thriving democracy, to a common good that might be something essential to a democracy. Once again, are we able to have this space here where we're able to exchange ideas? Or because we're so used to, you know, interacting in this way, maybe even this space kind of seems like, you know, I don't want to face any hostility, so I'm not going to bring my view. So we might say, oh, well, education is the answer. But if we don't produce a solid basis for it, and if social media might take away that basis for education, then what are we left with? So,
Yeah, and I agree with one of your many great points is about the difference between sort of analog real world interactions with people versus online. It goes back to Eunice's point too. I find people to be eminently more reasonable in the flesh than I do online, but I worry
no anonymity in that sense.
there's no anonymity, but I also worry that some of that coarseness that we're talking about in the online sphere starts to bleed into the day-to-day as well.
Right.
So Phil, Phil, I want to hear your thoughts. I also want to be mindful of our time here. I want to ask one more question, but I also want to hear from our audience. You all have questions, but technology, Phil, should we throw it overboard or what? What's your thought?
No. But if you don't mind, I want to point this out to you guys, and I know this isn't like a normal forum where people feel comfortable speaking up, so I'm going to ask you to step outside of your comfort zone and do it. You heard a lot of discussion. I'm not going to weigh in on anything that was said, but the discussion has been the idea that social media is having this very negative impact on political discourse among you guys. And I'm wondering, did what you said, did what Mark said, does that resonate? Is that your experience? Were they describing your experience on social media? Or is this like when older people look at younger people, we say, this is what's going on? I mean, or do younger people have a different perspective? So if you don't mind, just.
Well, I saw a couple of hands.
Okay, so go ahead.
Because especially with how crazy the last few elections have been, I'm sure everyone can agree. I actually found myself deleting some people and finding them because some of the things they were post were just so contrary to my own values. And maybe I shouldn't delete them. Maybe I should keep that in mind and keep that as part of my information base and just take what I like, maybe, but it's important to keep in mind what everyone else is thinking.
It's tough though, right? Because you want to balance these two challenges of, I don't want to be in my little bubble either, but maybe I don't want to be bombarded with information that I find, you know, hostile, negative, whatever, right? So whatever, right? So how do we find that balance? I think that's a great point, and it's tricky. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think social media is very divisive. I hardly ever really interact or use it. I just check posts. Okay, that's it. Like, I hardly use it anymore.
Because of its divisiveness.
Yeah, I think so.
What about some of you, because some of you guys all use social media, right? So go ahead and in the back.
Or I would try like stay away from people. I didn't have things used to be a lot. So that's kind of like what we do. But now I can actually do things right. So I'm like that's not much fun. I try like inform, but still like I don't want to be like all the time. So I try like balance, yes.
In the back. Go ahead, and then gentlemen up here. Go in the back.
I think that's to avoid social media completely because everything I see on there, I just find people echoing each other. And when I fact check stuff, it's almost always, if not wrong, like off the mark from what was true. And then the problem is that I have no idea where else to go for social interaction and for information. Like, I'm like, where on earth else do I go, but social media where everybody I know puts their information and those doesn't know.
That's interesting because I think the stereotype is that young people are devoted to social media and it's sort of embedded in their everyday lives. But what I'm hearing is pretty nuanced and pretty, in some ways, I don't want to say cynical, but you're clearly intelligent observers of what's happening on social media, and you're sort of willing to sort of move against it when it doesn't seem to be in your interest. And I think that's great to hear, honestly.
When I'm scrolling around on social media and I see like a post that I disagree with, I'm like, good. Cause I like to challenge. Like, I like to
Sure.
reaffirm my own beliefs. And I'm like, okay, I disagree with that, but Tom's not gonna convince me. I disagree with that, but I like to always be in a mode of like where my beliefs are always being tested and challenged. Like, not that happens all the time. Like, I want to make sure, like, okay, I really do, like, I feel strongly about this. I'm not gonna, cave because Susie posted about whatever. Yeah, I want to make sure, like, okay, I feel this way. I like seeing, okay, good, everyone is treated with whatever I think. So I keep going, feeling strong about my own.
And by the way, I want to point, so I appreciate the honesty of the
Yeah.
answer. So sometimes what happens is when we found this out doing research on like fact checking that newspapers do and experiments, sometimes encountering a person who's got an opposing view, it's not like you go, oh, I might need to reflect on what I think and evaluate. It's like, I'm dug in more than ever, right? Like it's like practice, like sharpening your sword for like, oh, what about this and this and this? So that the idea that even when we encounter people with opposing views, that necessarily means we're actually taking into consideration those views and reflecting on our own views. That may not be entirely accurate. I mean, my experience and yours are not that much different.
Right.
When I encounter people who I disagree with, it's like, this is going to be fun. Like, as long as they're respectful, this is going to be fun. And hopefully they give me good arguments. I'm probably not going to change my mind. But for anybody else who's paying attention, it would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, my issue is kind of going back to what they were saying, is that they would unfollow people just because they have different beliefs. But if you do that in real life, then you're surrounded by only people that have the same mindset as you, and there's no ground for the ability to agree to disagree. The whole reason that we have a democracy is to have different ideas and to come to a common ground. But if you cut out everybody, or if you don't fight, or if you don't do those things, then where are we really getting with democracy? So I feel like social media does have its good experiences because it does give you access to different kinds of platforms and different kinds of like medical advancements or technological advancements or democratic advancements and differences in the ability to see it worldwide. But cutting it off just at the start, just because you don't think that somebody agrees with you completely, is just a lack of being able to grow and being able to understand the world. It cuts you off from the world. So I see social media and that ability to grow and change having a good impact, but when your mindset is so shut off, then that's where you stop the ability to grow as yourself.
Yeah, and you can really manicure your social media account to
Yeah.
be very narrow. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and then yes.
I just want to say I completely agree with your point, because I mean, in life, we have to see the opposing view, because we're not always going to have people who agree with us. There's going to be people who disagree, and if we just only see our side and only have people who see our side, then that's just going to divide a society.
Yeah.
That's the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, this one.
Yeah, to kind of go along with what they're saying about local, like, it's not inherent, like, social media doesn't need to do that, but it does, like, look at what you see and then give you what, you want, which is fine. If I'm on a social media site for entertainment and memes, I don't want to see political stuff. But if I want to see political stuff, I want to see political stuff. I don't want to see one side of it, which is what social media often does. But, it can change to just put political stuff all under one category and just give you that. And I think it would improve a lot of the division.
Yes.
I don't think social media applies to the good side of each party. They only show the bad sides of each party. So you don't get like what one side really wants to push. You get what the other side doesn't want to push. So it's very one-sided on the fact where like if I'm looking for pros on abortion, which I probably wouldn't. That's bad. They only give us the bad stuff. Like for gun control, they only give the bads about it, but they don't give the good side about gun control.
And I'm gonna, if we disagree, I'm going to characterize you in the worst possible way, and you're gonna do the same to me.
Exactly.
Right, and I'll just say one final thing, because I know we want to wrap this up. When we talk about, and I agree with much of what Eunice and Marco said, but one of the things I noticed with my students is the things that they call propaganda are almost always things they disagree with. And the things that they call truth are the things they agree with.
Yeah.
And so the bias, one of the biases that we should always be on guard for is our own bias. Like, what are we bringing to the picture? And then being mindful of it. But I appreciate all you guys' comments, because you guys are nuanced. And this gets back to our original discussion. It's because you guys are nuanced that the democracy needs your participation. Because I think one of the things that happens as we get older is we lose some of that nuance. And so your voices are so important.
Question from Zoom. Oh.
So we have someone that's from Australia, now living in the US, saying that in Australia it's mandatory to vote. So they're wondering why I don't have a year in the US. Why isn't talking about participation being involved? Why isn't it?
Well, just so you know, in Australia, if you don't vote, you're fine. And so, to me, I think in the United States, the right to vote is also the right not to vote. We're just trying to encourage you not to exercise that right not to vote. So I think that that's the individualism that is sort of accompanies sort of American thinking. Is no, you're not supposed to be forced to vote.
Yeah, and I think there's a historical tradition in the United States, which is maybe a suspicion of certain institutions and government, and so compulsory voting has just never really taken root here. I can't speak to Australia's history, but I do echo your thoughts on that. We have like 3 minutes. I wish we had 3 hours. Really quickly, if we could sum up, we can't sum up anything, but I want to go back to Eunice and Marco and Phil really quickly. I'll start with you, Eunice, really quickly. I hate to do this, but what are you optimistic about when you think about young people and democracy today? What are you, as you look to the future, what are you optimistic about?
Well, I think there are signs, and I think we saw tonight with the higher rates of participation amongst young people at the last week's midterm elections in the United States. So there are signs that the issues that we are facing now, and they are very big issues, the climate emergency, those values issues, from questions on abortion to how we see diversity in our society, gay rights, and so on, LGBTQ rights, and these are really important issues. And it's a reminder that actually politics is not only about the mundane, it's about morality. And when we are voting for candidates, we are choosing different conceptions of the good life. And now we are presented with quite distinct conceptions of the good life. And that mobilizes young voters to participate. And I hope they will continue. And there was a very, very healthy reminder of that a few years ago in the referendum in Ireland about abortion, and that legalized abortion. There was a massive discussion in Irish society that created a lot of engagement. There was a citizens' assembly and then a referendum, and incredible high turnout, from young people, in particular young women. There were flights coming from Australia, the United Kingdom, all over the world, of young people flying to Ireland to participate in that important referendum. So when I think that the important thing is to know all political decisions impact our lives, so it is important to vote. The other thing is that we don't live our lives also on social media. We are having this discussion. Social media can be a help. Well, I'm joining you tonight using technology, so I'm not present in the room, and we are able to have this conversation. And this is a reminder that we can listen and learn from others. We are not only living our lives online. From there, you take young, engaged voters can lead to a lot of change, not only voting, but, organizing campaigns, organizing petitions, signing petitions, getting involved in the media, getting involved in student government. These are all good habits, because it's the only way to keep our governments in check, and to make sure that as well, that the good chaps are governing, or at least the bad chap, we can get rid of the bad chaps who govern us.
I think that's a great point to end on. I'm going to cut off my colleagues here, but I want to say they're used to it. You're right that we've been talking about voting, and that's important, but you're so right when you say that there are many democracy with a little d is really valuable. There's so many ways young people and all of us can get involved in our institute, strengthening our institutions, strengthening our democracy, which have to do with participating in conversations like this, certainly have to do with voting, but getting out of your community and being a part of the greater quest for a common good, right? Last thoughts, 30 seconds, last thoughts, guys.
Thank you all for being here. I mean, it's really is a joy to be able to be up here and speaking into a room with people who are reflecting and thinking about their own needs. So.
Yeah, and I'm optimistic for you guys, just through a conversation. It was worth putting the suit on for.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Thank you.